It's time for our next installment of this Hall of Faith series. And today's reference, the next reference in the Hall of Faith, we've been walking through this entire chapter of Hebrews 11, looking at all these different references of these people that by faith did all of these things, and trying to figure out what we can learn and what the author's trying to teach us about not giving up and not shrinking back and what it means to persevere. And all of these people seem to be examples of folks that know how to persevere, and we're trying to learn what that looks like. I have a bunch of work going on at my house today, by the way. If you hear a bunch of banging and hammers and work, that's what's going on in the background. But this is today, the next reference is a really short reference. One verse, one sentence, and not really a whole lot there to read. It might be even a shorter discussion today. Maybe not a whole lot to even talk about necessarily in this video. But I think it may not be a long discussion, but I think potentially it could be a very profound one, like a lesson that we could really truly take with us and could really shape us in quite a lot of ways, I think. And I don't even know if I've got this verse right. I don't even know if I've nailed it. But as I've sat and prepared for this video and thought about what this lesson is that we might find here, I think, if I'm not completely wrong, I think there's a really interesting lesson here. So here's the verse. You ready? So we've looked at creation, we've looked at Abel, we've looked at Enoch, we've looked at Noah, we've looked at Avram, we've looked at Sarah, we looked at Avram again. All these people who didn't receive what they had been promised, but they were by faith pursuing the story of God. We looked at the last video was about Abraham sacrificing Isaac. We talked about the wacky nature of that story, but also what we were trying to see, what Jewish wisdom, what the Jewish commentary has tried to teach us throughout the ages about that story. But then there's this. Listen to this. One sentence. Here's the next character. By faith, Isaac. Okay, so now it's the Isaac character. So when you think about Isaac's life, I didn't even get halfway into the sentence. When you think about Isaac's life, why is Isaac a model of faith? Like, why is Isaac going to be mentioned in Hebrews 11 in the Hall of Faith? Isaac, what is it that Isaac does? Let's see what it says. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. And you hear that and you're like, wait, that's his great moment of faithfulness? Like, Isaac is in the Hall of Faith because he was willing to bless his sons? Why is that such a move of faith? Well, as I thought about that story, you know what's crazy about that story for me? And it's not all that crazy in the biblical world, because they would have seen, like, Isaac goes to give blessings to his sons. This isn't necessarily a crazy idea. This is something you would have done in this ancient world. Bless your son. Talk about his future. And yet, if you remember the story, this is where Isaac is blind, and Jacob steals Esau's blessing. So Isaac had, I'm assuming he had prayerfully prepared for this day. Like, Isaac had really spent some time thinking about who his sons were and what he thought God was going to do in the future through who they were. And he had prayerfully prepared these blessings. And he had one blessing intended for Esau, and he had another blessing intended for Isaac. And of course, as the story goes, Jacob ends up kind of stepping in and stealing Esau's blessing. Which, when you read that story as like a Western American, 3,000 years later, you end up looking at it and you're like, why doesn't Isaac just kind of like call a timeout and say, that you weren't supposed to steal his blessing, that blessing was meant for him, and that blessing was meant for you? Like, why doesn't he just fix it? And part of the reason in their culture is that they believed that these words, these pronouncements, these blessings, they believed that words had power. That these blessings that are pronounced, they believed that they weren't just empty words. Like, they believed that these words carried, like they were packed full of potential, like they were going to shape somebody's life. And they had prayerfully prepared them. And so when these words go out, you just don't take them back. In their minds, you can't. And so here's Isaac, who has prayerfully prepared a blessing for Esau that ends up being given to Jacob. And then a blessing that he thought was for Jacob that ends up landing on Esau. And it made me, in my mind, what I think I realized about Isaac's move of faithfulness is that he trusts that God's at work behind that. What feels like a total, complete mistake to him. Like what feels to him like, no, wait a minute, that's not your blessing. That was his blessing. He sends the blessings out and believes, I didn't see that coming. That doesn't feel right to me, but that must be what God wants to do. There's a great book by Rabbi David Fohrman. It's called Genesis, a Parashah Companion. And I'll put that book in the description to this video because I think it's an amazing resource. And in that book, Rabbi Fohrman talks about how he believes Rebecca, the mom, she actually thinks that Isaac, the dad, is wrong about his sons. She sees some things in Jacob that she thinks Isaac might be missing. Like Isaac sees things in Esau that he loves and he honors, and he's not so sure that he sees the same kind of potential in his son Jacob. And Rebecca seems to be the opposite. She seems to see the potential in her son Jacob. And so she's trying to, the reason why she's getting in the mix, and he does this great job talking about it, so you've got to get the book and read it for yourself. But they have this, and so here's Isaac, and I wonder if in fact God's kind of winking in the background because he said this was going to happen. God already said, like chapters before in the story, God already told Rebecca that this would happen, this would take place. So Rebecca, not only does she have this motherly, this maternal intuition, but Rebecca also had a prayerful promise from God. She's doing her best to walk in faith. And here's Isaac, and he's doing his best too, but it would seem like in this respect, Isaac's gotten some things wrong. Luckily, God and Rebecca are already kind of at work, and it's a mess. I say luckily, and yet it's kind of a dysfunctional mess, and it kind of seems a little twisted. That's how life is oftentimes. Our stories are a little messy, a little twisted. But Isaac might be wrong here, and yet God's story somehow takes over. And what does Isaac do? He walks in faithfulness. He says to himself, this is not what I intended. This is not what I thought was going to happen. But it must be what God's up to. I spent time in prayer. I prepared for this moment. I did my part. And then when it came to execution, it didn't roll out the way I anticipated, but all the other things were in place. I didn't necessarily act in rebellion. This must be what God has in store. And in fact, it was what God had in store. It was exactly what Isaac was supposed to do. And so by choosing to bless his sons, and then to not freak out, to not undo the blessing, to not utter curses, we've seen characters like Noah utter curses. Isaac just trusts the process. He trusts the story. He believes that God must be up to something. Again, God is up to something that I don't see. God is up to something that I don't understand. God is up to something that I couldn't perceive or conceive of. And he lets the blessings go. And I do think that this is one lesson, this one verse, this one sentence, actually is a lesson that I could take with me. I could actually learn pretty good, I could apply this, pretty good application here. Because how many times in my life, and some of us struggle with this more than others, I struggle with this. I'm a control freak. And so I want to control circumstances. I want to control relationships. I want to control the responses of others. How many of us struggle? Like we have these relationships that matter to us or relationships we're struggling with, and we want to control the response of the other person. And go figure, you can't control how the other person responds. It's just not something you can control. I like to deny this. I like to live in a lot of denial. I like to believe that if I can manipulate stuff just right, if I can control their response, I can control my children, my kids, I can control my spouse, I can control my friends. And maybe control is an abrasive word, but the point remains that there are realities that are outside of I can't control my kids. So I have to trust. I have to trust that that we as parents have done the things we wanted to do. We've done our best. We've put it out there. I have to trust that my kids want to follow God. And if they don't, those choices are theirs. I have to let go. I have to trust that God is up to something that I may not perceive. I think my kids are going to get to God this direction. And they take off that way, and I have to believe, I have to trust, God must be doing something. And they'll find God in that direction. Sometimes this might happen in our marriages. Sometimes this might happen in our churches. Sometimes this might happen in the communities, sports teams that we coach or that we play in. Friend groups. We think that stuff should go this direction. We think, and we've done all this work, and we've prayed, and we've done all this, we've spent all this time in deep spiritual preparation, and then it doesn't roll out at all like we thought, like sometimes the opposite. And we put one foot in front of the other, and we believe that God must be up to something. Just because it didn't go the way that I thought it for sure had to go, doesn't mean that God's not God, doesn't mean that this isn't exactly what he wants to work with. And so by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. And it didn't go the way he thought it would go. Not even a little. It went like the opposite of what he thought. And yet. And it was a dysfunctional mess. It was. That family Jacob was in a dysfunctional, crazy place. But still, it still went exactly like God wanted it to go. Man, control freaks unite to learn this lesson from this one passing verse in the Hall of Faith. May we be open, especially if you're like me, especially if you need to learn this lesson. May we be changed by this one little reference. And we'll see what the next one is in the next video.